Thank you very much, Dietmar. Thank you, Sebastian. We're coming now to the panel discussion. And you can see people are sitting down. As an annual high point of the conference, we're looking for responses to questions that move all of us. Who is going to stop the far right? And Stefan Huth from the Junge Welt is going to introduce all of the participants on the panel. Good evening, and a warm welcome to the final panel discussion at the 29th Rosa Luxemburg Conference. I'm pleased that so many of you are here and that this hall is so full and that there's a great deal of interest. What we'll be talking about now is who's going to stop the far right. This is a very pressing and urgent issue. It is so pressing, but we didn't realize quite how pressing when we started planning this conference. It was clear in early summer that this was going to be our final panel discussion, but then events in recent weeks really snowballed. You will be all aware of the fact, and I'm not just talking about the events of this week or the news and the investigative research of Kollektiv, who have found out what's going on in their investigative journalism. It's fascinating what they found out in a number of different ways. Remigration is the buzzword of this scandal. And you would imagine that under other conditions, there would have been massive outrage in the AfD itself, but they recoined it positively in their reporting and said, a member of the parliamentary group said, this isn't a secret plan, it's a promise. And that wasn't one opinion. The entire parliamentary group supported it, according to social media and others. And it's perhaps symptomatic for the situation that we currently find ourselves in. What we're dealing with here is a phenomenon that is something we have to think about in a different way than we did in 1 or 2, 3 years. The far-right AfD is more and more in the center. We have heard, according to surveys, that if there were elections tomorrow, they would be the second strongest party in parliament. Last year, they won the first state parliament mandate, and as we reported in our latest issue, they're about to get the second one in Thuringia. In Pirna, in December, it was the first time that they were elected as a Lord Mayor, which means they have really arrived in the heart of our society, which is a terrible development. And it's one that is taking place against the background of the fact that the heart of our society is further and further right. And as Chancellor Scholz said, there's big deportation plans on the card. So he's really taking the lead on that matter. Now, the firewall that we have heard about, not just from the conservative CDUs, the firewall towards the right has holes in it now. What we're seeing is a racist climate in this country that is predominant. I can imagine that people from ethnic minorities, this is an extremely unpleasant situation, but also for leftists, it is a real challenge. And there are a number of different questions of strategic alliances emerge in this context that we want to look at in a bit more detail today, not least the question of what about broad-based alliances to prevent party congresses at AFDs, and how to stop the supporters of the Scholz who want the same thing as the far-right AfD, namely large-scale deportation, i.e. taking on the right-wing agenda completely. The question facing us then is, how can the battle against fascists be linked to the battle against predatory forces in society generally and war, and what approaches are successful in the trade union battle against the right and in recent weeks and months, something that's been debated at more length is what is a left position towards the AfD? Should they be banned? Should other groups be banned? What implications would this have, not least with reference to the left-wing forces in this country? Would they be next, or is it all part of the plan? So these are the questions that we're going to be looking at in the next hour that we've got left for this debate. And I would like to welcome my guests here on the panel. We have Alev Bahadir from Nuremberg. Welcome to you, Alev. She was born in Mannheim, grew up there, but is now based in Franconia or Bavaria. She lives in Nuremberg and is managing director of the migrant organization DIDF Jugend Youth Bavaria. And part of her job is that she is the editor of the Yeni Hayat, which appears every 2 weeks. It is a bilingual German-Turkish paper, and she's responsible for the German side. So welcome to you, Alev. And a very warm welcome as well to Żaklin Nastić. She is second to the left. She was born in Bonn. She is caring for dependent relatives. She's in the services union Verdi, and she's in an anti-fascist organization as well from 2008 to 2023. She's been a member of the left party, Die Linke, and from 2017 was a member of the parliament for Die Linke, and she's been spokesman for human rights, the committee there, since when she left the Linke party in November. She's about to set up her own, or she's joined the alliance Sahra Wagenknecht. And a warm welcome to you. And I'd also like to welcome Shabnam Shariatpanahi from Duisburg. Welcome to you, Shabnam. As a child, she was born in Iran. Her parents were persecuted. She came to Germany when she was 12, grew up here. She's a pedagogue trained. She's a member of the German Communist Party. She's active in the Easter March movement and in various other activist organizations in Düsseldorf, and she's running as candidate in June for the German Communist Party European elections, where she has list position 4. Welcome to you, Shabnam.
Neben mir sitzt Luca Stüven aus Hamburg. Auch ihr ein herzliches Willkommen. Sie ist aktiv in einem Zusammenschluss marxistischer, kommunistischer Gruppen, Perspektive Kommunismus, hat eine Website, kann man sich genau anschauen. Die Aktivitäten im Detail ist eine bundesweite Organisation revolutionärer und kommunistischer Gruppen. Sie geht nämlich der Selbstdarstellung und ihren Worten und ihrem Beitrag, den sie wie alle Mitdiskutanten hier vorab in der Jungen Welt veröffentlicht hat, als kleinen Input auch für dieses Podium. Es geht hier um grundlegende theoretische Arbeit, aber nicht nur das, auch um den Kampf auf der Straße. Es geht aber auch um Geschichtspolitik und um Mobilisierung zu Demos, Protesten, Aktivitäten rund um den Frauenkampftag und vor allen Dingen mit Blick auf den 1. Mai. Herzlich willkommen, Luca.
Women's rights as well. Warm welcome to you, Luca.
Ich finde es toll, dass wir wieder ein Podium haben mit einem Übergewicht an Frauen. Vielleicht schaffen wir es im nächsten Jahr, ein reines Frauenpodium zu machen. Dann wäre ich auch überflüssig und das wäre vielleicht ein Schritt in die richtige Richtung. Aber trotzdem, wir reden über Inhalte und deswegen ganz herzliches Willkommen Gerd Wiegel, vielen von euch bekannt als Autor, als Menschen, als Referent für Rechtsextremismus, das ist die offizielle Bezeichnung gewesen, oder ist immer noch für Rechtsextremismus und Antifaschismus für die Fraktion Die Linke im Deutschen Bundestag. Das hat er von 2006 bis 2023 gemacht. Seit März 1923 ist er Leiter des Referats für Demokratie, Migrations- und Antirassismuspolitik beim DGB Bundesvorstand. Herzlich willkommen, Gerd Wiegel.
Warm welcome, Gerd Wiegel.
So, genug der einleitenden Worte. Alev, gehen wir mit dir. Du hast auch, wie alle anderen, wie ich gerade sagte, einen Beitrag geschrieben als kleinen Input für unsere Runde. Und hast darin geschrieben, die bürgerliche Politik schafft durch Sozialabbau und Kriegspolitik den Nährboden für die Rechte und sagst, das ist ein Zitat, das könnte auch der Nährboden für linke, fortschrittliche Kräfte sein. Vielleicht kannst du mal ausführen, genau als du es in dem kurzen Beitrag machen konntest, wie das konkret aussehen könnte.
Terms. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to be here, and I'm really happy to see so many of you so that we can answer together the question how we can fight the right together. An important basis to which I refer in my contribution and my quote is that the rise of the right-wing forces of the AfD is something that didn't come out of the blue. We're looking back to decades of a neoliberal policy which has created the fertile ground for that. We all know numerous examples showing how, when it comes to the health industry, that the services had become cut back upon, how privatization campaigns were kicked off. We see the repercussions of that during the COVID pandemic. We also can see it in the education system, where we saw how the education system during times of crisis has turned out to be so desolate that it can't take people along and reach out to people. Now, today in 2024, we're looking at a massive year of budget cutbacks. We have followed what the federal government budgeted. We have seen and witnessed the cuts in the budget. And no matter where we look, pension system, the increase of the carbon dioxide tax, the citizens' allowance, no matter where we look at, we see that at the receiving end of cutbacks, we see the weakest and most vulnerable parts of society, unemployed workers, while corporations continue to receive subsidies, while the federal armed forces receive increasing budgets. And at the same time, we need to witness that the working population sees that the rug is pulled under their feet. And this basis made it possible for the right forces, for the right-wing forces, to strengthen themselves. We know it from history. In times of economic constraints and crises, there are two options. It's either the socialist and progressive forces, the left forces, who are able to use this situation in order to raise the awareness for the root causes of these problems. And this root cause is the capitalist system, which can only survive by exploiting our labor, by creating added value consistently through the work that we put down. They wage wars to secure trade routes, to secure natural resources. And it's always the working class who's at the losing end. And only left and progressive forces can raise the awareness for these truths, for these root causes of problems. So that's one option. And that is, if we look back at the current year and the last years, we are seeing that we've got the answers to the problems that we are seeing all around us. But we, the left-wing forces and alliances, and we have to look into the mirror and be critical of ourselves. We did not manage to use these circumstances for ourselves. It just developed into the opposite direction. Right-wing forces used these problems and exploited them for their racist and right-wing policies by just offering simplified answers to complicated questions. They are saying, yes, they are the ones who are to blame for the situation. You would be in a better situation without migrants, without recipients of a citizen allowance. So they use these problems, as we all know. And we all know that fascism cannot be separated from the capital and capitalism. It's the just most aggressive form of capitalism. And the AfD used this fertile ground that was created to show just a seeming alternative for people. And they instead protect and perpetuate this system. It's not only the AfD we're talking about. Over years, we have seen this development in front of our eyes. We have now reached a stage where even the mainstream parties are fraying at the edges. The mainstream parties have created the fertile ground by publishing manifestos against migrants and refugees in yellow press papers like the Bild Zeitung. And these right-wing policies are being pursued by mainstream parties to win voters for themselves. Now, we, the progressive forces, have to come in here with a loud voice, because the problems that we see around us can only be solved through us and not through the right-wing forces.
Gerd Wiegel, du bist beim Deutschen Gewerkschaftsbund beschäftigt und mit diesen Fragen täglich befasst. Mich würde interessieren, also Alev hat gerade ausgeführt, die Werktätigen, die Arbeiterklasse, Leidtragenden der Umverteilungspolitik, die natürlich in Zeiten der Zeitenwende nochmal neue Formen angenommen hat, die Umverteilung, die ein neues Maß von unten nach oben angenommen hat. Also die Zahlen sind jetzt ziemlich eindeutig. Wie wird der Aufschwung der Rechten, der Auftrieb, dieser Höhenflug innerhalb der Gewerkschaft, innerhalb des DGB speziell diskutiert? Welche Gegenstrategien werden erörtert?
Well, we're taking notice of the current developments with a lot of concern. I've just said it, that we're dealing here with a development and not something that has been around for 10 years, ever since the AfD has been around, but it is something that has characterized our times for the last 25 years. When I look at the first time when these parties were successful, it was started in the late 1990s, in the early 2000s. This is what we are witnessing in the Western capitalist countries of the world, where this capitalism is most firmly rooted. Trade unions, social democratic parties have supported this way of neoliberalization. That's opened the field for their activities. Germany came a little bit late with the AfD, 2013. That's where it's the kickoff time, and we have seen similar developments taking place in other countries much, much earlier, like in France, elsewhere. But today, we're in front of a fundamental crisis of the liberal democratic system. Everybody talks about a crisis of democracy, and it's not yet clear whether this political system will be able to be maintained and stay in the way we got used to it. If you look at Argentina, Brazil, and elsewhere, the United States, we can see that things can spiral downward very quickly. And many are asking themselves what to do in this situation. I've been with the DGB now for half a year only, not longer. I already said that trade unionists are not immune against these right-wing paroles and mottos. And trade union members also vote in favor of AfD, even more than the average does. So for the time being, we are wondering, with a view to the election years 2024-2025, what can we do? And we need to strengthen our content bases. It's not enough anymore. And that is what trade unions did for a long time, where they said we're dealing here with an extremely right neo-fascist party. Don't vote them in, but we have to. That's not enough to just make such statements, but we have to deal with them on the basis of content, of discussions. So we try to prepare our own people for discussions, for debates. We want to make use those options available to us. We want to work on the shop floor level available to trade unions. We need to raise these topics on the shop floor level. We need to talk and discuss the content being offered by the AfD. Alev said it. It's very clear. Content-wise, this party has nothing to offer. Hardly anything, particularly those who vote AfD are people who suffer the most under the development of the last 20 years, were affected by it to the largest extent. A current DGB study made it clear that those who would foot the bill if the AfD took on political responsibility, they are a large part of their electorate, because their programs and the real policies they are pursuing basically strengthens this neoliberal capitalism. That is something that we need to bring across to people. And it's important for trade unionists to discuss these topics in the companies, on shop floors, and we try to strengthen our position there and prepare our people for such debates, and we can get back to that point later in more detail. Many, particularly in Eastern Germany, are saying that we're dealing with a massive and right-wing hegemony. For a trade union secretary who organizes a town hall, trade union town hall in Eisenach, would think twice before raising such a topic, because many of the workers there would say, that's my party that you're talking about, it's the AfD. So the question is, how aggressive will we be when we deal with these topics, raise these topics, and how strongly can we raise our own left political ideas in these discussions on the shop floor level in companies that will be decisive in the year to come, in order to regain those who are supporting AfD, although not with a deep conviction, and for those who are still hesitating, who are wondering whether it could be an option for them, but who are not convinced racists. And that will be an important discussion to be led in this and the next years.
Żaklin, du hast die Partei Die Linke verlassen, der du viele Jahre Mitglied gewesen bist, und hast es unter anderem, du hast es ja auch ausgeführt in einem Beitrag, den wir vorab veröffentlicht haben, mit der Begründung, sie habe den Kontakt zu den Massen, sag ich jetzt mal, verloren, vertrete nicht mehr ihre Interessen. Kannst du ein bisschen genauer ausführen noch, was im Detail die Punkte waren, wo du Anschluss genommen hast, oder was den letztlichen Ausschlag gegeben hat?
As those that reflected the party losing the contact. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. It was not easy for any of us after so many years of activities of voluntary help across many levels, including the level of work in Parliament, to leave the left party, Die Linke. But we fought around this party for many years. And over the last 2 years, the work in the parliamentary group was very difficult. I work in international relations, defense policy, human rights policy were my focal points. And in front of the speech of the Chancellor, where he called for 100 billion euros to be spent on the military budget. And if I get the recommendation to abstain in the vote, then such an abstention is neither left nor anti-capitalist, nor could it be a contribution towards more peace on the world. We had a virtual meeting before. Sahra, myself, Andre, we spoke out against abstention, but we were called, and I was already in the plenary, we were urged to leave the plenary because we would be a damage to the party if we voted no. And only when Scholz pledged this 100 billion, before the motion was just a blank paper that we were asked to sign to support this government, something I would never, ever do. And we all politically active people. I worked on the local level, and then I went to German parliament. Everybody knows if you don't have any figures, when everything is being done to support Ukraine, when soldiers are being sent to the Eastern Front without mentioning any number, when it's being said that money and weapons are to be supplied without mentioning any number, then I'm saying, well, it's not my party anymore.
And I'm very pleased about this discussion, and I was very glad to read all of the views that were published ahead of this panel, because we're not that far apart. There needs to be a counter model to this policy. It is the reason why the far-right AfD has emerged at all and why it has become so strong. What we experienced was, I mean, when Bodo Ramelow says supplying weapons is good and Sahra Wagenknecht says it isn't good, and we condemn an economic war against Russia, then who's being attacked? Robert Habeck is talking about an economic war, and an opposition politician's not allowed to talk about that? I mean, what kind of a world is that? And it wasn't easy for us, but we need a counter model to this prevailing policy. And I don't think that I have to tell you very much about Ms. Baerbock's policy. Unfortunately, I can't hear you, but maybe we can speak afterwards briefly. If Ms. Baerbock, the German foreign minister, declares war on Russia in front of the Council of Europe, if I'm on an Easter march and get shouted at because I was on it, I mean, I'm shocked. I would never have believed that the peace march is being attacked by members of the left party, Die Linke. Because if the Linke doesn't support peace, then who's going to? And that's why it was a necessary step to leave the party.
Da möchte ich gleich anknüpfen dran und Shabnam fragen. Also Żaklin sagt, und das ist so, wenn man die Texte liest, aber auch nicht ganz, wenn man sie genau liest. Wir liegen nicht so weit auseinander. Das ist ja wirklich interessant, also wie es sozusagen den Medien gelungen ist, also den Bürgerlichen, diese Friedensbewegung als rechtsoffen zu labeln. Also es gab ja Demobilisierung, geradezu Warnung, auch in der Linkspartei selber, also zur großen Demo hinzugehen gegen die Kriegspolitik am 25. Februar. Was wäre als Kommunistin dein Ansatz, sozusagen, die Leute, die betroffen sind von dieser fürchterlichen Umverteilung und den Folgen, von dem Krieg ganz zu schweigen, zu gewinnen, sie auf die Straße zu bringen und eine Gegenkraft zu organisieren, die dieser Politik etwas entgegensetzt?
What kind of policy can you present as a countermodel? Well, I can only speak from the more practical side of things. I think that's why I'm sitting here, because it's about the practical basis of my party. Our alliances have to be anti-fascist and anti-capitalist. So that means we go into alliances where we are fighting against crisis and war. We've got such an alliance in Duisburg, in the Ruhr Valley. This will be one that you're familiar with. It's very much impacted on by poverty, and in most of the boroughs there, I can say you can actually see poverty. Austerity measures have impacted on infrastructure. There's hardly any pediatric doctors, the trams, you know, the schools, all the way down to nursery. There's hardly anything available because so much has been saved. You know, at the start of the year, we have over 1,000 children who haven't got a place in a school. We're talking about obligatory school, but there's no school that can take these children. And these are all things that cause discontent, and that's hardly surprising. And I think that it's only really positive to do anti-fascist work in connection with social protests, with alliances like Heating Bread and Peace, which is where we go into these boroughs, we have a stand, we draw attention to the fact that we have this and show people that there's 100 billion that is being spent on defense, but it could be spent for many other things to improve people's lives, for example, in Duisburg. And I think we have to reach these people where they are and where they're impacted on, by the dismantling of the social welfare state. And in the neighborhoods that we go to, people really are impacted on this. We've made a bunch of posters where we write 100 billion for schools education instead of for arms. And that draws people's attention. I don't know if you've ever been on a stand like this. Usually people don't really know how to get in. They don't really know whether they should talk to you or not. But if they see your poster from far away and think, this is an important issue to me, then they do give us their peace of mind. You know, they tell us what they're thinking. And so we've entered into alliances with organizations. We've also translated our flyers into different languages so we can reach out to the migrant communities in Duisburg as well and enter into a conversation with them. We have to do what I think we haven't done for years, and that is enter into conversations with people. We've been offering social advice. You know, these are not easy things to do. I have to say that as well, because, of course, it takes a lot of work. It means that all of us have just volunteers, and every 2 weeks you have to do an info stand. Every 2 weeks you have to have breakfast and offer social advice. We have a different kind of social advice than you might classically know. I mean, I'm a social worker, and I work in a social advice center in Duisburg professionally, but it's different because we combine it with breakfast. We want to actually talk to people. We don't just want to solve their acute problems, but rather tell them why these acute problems come up and how we can combat this together with migrant communities, workers from EU countries as well. There are very many people who are working for subcontractors for Thyssen, for example, but also the employees who work in the Thyssen companies and their subcontractors. We have to convince all of these workers to do that. But we can only do that by reaching out and entering into a conversation with them and not talking about theory, but really being on the street.
Luca, in eurer Gruppe macht ihr viel Theoriearbeit, viel auch geschichtsbezogene Aufklärungsarbeit, aber ihr macht auch sehr viel praktische Arbeit. Viel Vernetzungsarbeit, viel Arbeit vor Ort. Wir haben gesprochen über Bündnispolitik. Es ist auch angeklungen zumindest, dass diese alte Taktik, AfD-Parteitage zu blockieren, nicht unbedingt zielführend ist, wenn diese Partei jetzt eben diese hohen Werte hat bei Wahlen und auch sonst sie eben hat. Du hast in deinem Beitrag, und da würde ich gerne mehr darüber erfahren, als Beispiel für konkrete antifaschistische Arbeit die antifaschistische Aktion Süd genannt. Vielleicht kannst du mal aus der Praxis erzählen und wie geht ihr bündnispolitisch vor? Was sind eure Stoßrichtungen im Kampf?
in the struggle. Well, the anti-fascist Alliance South is something we think needs to be supported, a situation in which the anti-fascist movement is quite weak. We see it as a positive example, where there's a focus on organizing ourselves, joining forces among anti-fascist groups, and ensuring that we are able to join forces and develop a strong front against the far right, having major demonstrations against AfD party congresses, and on the grounds mobilizing against the far right AfD as well, getting people on the streets to combat them. Like I said, that's just one example that we think is good. On the whole, I think we would say that with reference for the battle against the far right, there are a couple of aspects you have to bear in mind. You can't just respond to it with one point. I mean, we have to have forces that explain the contradictions of capitalism and tackle this prevailing crisis, i.e. this idea that capitalism is in a crisis and it can't make concessions, and many people are looking to the far right, but the far right are a force all of their own, which are gaining strength in this phase. And for us, that means it's not just about undermining the far right by providing our left-wing positions, but also actively exposing their positions for what they are, namely hostile class positions. We have to take them seriously and we have to combat them. And it's also about not just coming up with an alternative left-wing movement, but it's about the direct confrontation and seeking such confrontation with the far right and just pushing them back out of the limelight. It's sort of proactive self-protection. That's how we would describe it, because the historic experience that we have, but also the experience of recent decades, has shown that every space that the far right can fill, the fascists can fill, limits the left wing as well, and means that the process for building up to a revolution is limited as well, and it goes against the working classes. And we must consistently limit the space that the far right are able to occupy.
Ich möchte Alev vielleicht auf einen Aspekt.
Ich
möchte darauf eingehen, also weil wir haben gesprochen und Gerd hat es betont, das ist ja kein deutsches Phänomen, das breitet sich aus, also Krise des bürgerlichen Parlamentarismus, verbunden natürlich mit einer Krise des Kapitalismus, des Imperialismus auch. Es gibt, das ist noch nicht ein Thema, aber wird möglicherweise eins werden, Bestrebungen auch seitens der AfD in migrantische Milieus, würden die wohl sagen, vorzustoßen, also Leute mit Migrationsgeschichte für sich zu gewinnen. Das würde mich mal interessieren, für wie gefährlich du das hältst. Verbunden mit der Frage, dass es natürlich auch zum Beispiel in der türkischstämmigen Community rechte Kräfte gibt, die auch hierzulande wirken, also graue Wölfe und alles, was damit dranhängt. Wie würdest du den Kampf gegen rechts, also das ist ja unser Thema, die Rechten stoppen, unter diesem Aspekt beschreiben?
To look at this aspect when it comes to stopping the far right? Well, there's something that's really not that well known. Sorry, that was my pen, but anyway, whatever. Within the AfD, there are also attempts to reach ethnic Turkish people in their communities, and typically ethnic Turkish communities tend to vote people that they think they pursue policy that is migrant-friendly. But I think we mustn't overlook the fact that these attempts to divide and rule are not just ones trying to divide ethnic Germans and ethnic minority background communities, but also takes place within ethnic communities. There are attempts to divide people within individual communities as well. So if we look at how the ruling class have a valuation logic by saying we only want to allow people into the country, or specifically recruit them into this country, in order to have a means of exerting pressure on the domestic working class and say, hey, look, at any point we can recruit people into the country. If you don't want to do this work, they will. And that, of course, means that they are avoiding talking about some of the awful conditions in certain sectors that people work in, because we're recruiting people here whose very lives are at risk in their home countries, and here they can work for the worst conditions, under the worst conditions, for the worst wages, and don't protest against them because their residence permits are often very much linked to being in gainful employment. And these attempts to create divisions are there between people who have lived here for a long time and those who've recently immigrated into the country. So if you look at ethnic Turkish people in Germany, many came in the 1960s to Germany. So many of us are in the third or fourth generation in Germany. Here too, there are threats that if you don't do what you're supposed to do, we will bring new people into the country and they will do the work that you don't want to do. So there are attempts to create divisions within the working classes. We mustn't underestimate this. And that's why we mustn't neglect to, or what we have to do is basically organize ethnic minorities in the working classes too, because they're part of the working class in this country now as well. And the second aspect that you refer to is very important, because there are other forces who, there are 3 million ethnic Turkish people in this country, and there are regressive forces who are trying to get these people to be instrumentalized for their policy. Erdogan was in Cologne and said years ago, become German citizens, but don't get assimilated, pursue Turkish policies. And the AKP are doing that too, whether they're called UED or DIDF, but whatever they're called. There is active policy of division undertaken here, and we see this again and again with specific examples. We saw it when there were the Turkish parliamentary elections. They were brought to Germany. On both sides, there's an interest to divide the working classes. On the one hand, in terms of the status of the German government, who are saying, well, let them vote. That way we will divide them. And on the other hand, the Turkish government, who is also trying to exert their influence via these 3 million people in the ethnic Turkish communities here. And that's why it's important, and we say that as DIDF, and we've been saying it for years, that both Turkish nationalism and German racism both have to be combated consistently, because it leads to the division of the working classes, and it weakens solidarity, which is our most important weapon in this battle.
Gerd, da will ich direkt dran anschließen. Also diese Politik, das nenne ich ja jetzt mal so Teile und Herrsche. Du sprachst von Spaltungspolitik, ist ein genuin gewerkschaftliches Thema auch. Und das hat ja 2 Ebenen, wenn ich es richtig sehe, also anschließend an das, was Alev gesagt hat. Es geht zum einen um diesen Aspekt Lohndrückerei, also die billigen Arbeitskräfte, die berühmten, die Arbeit machen für geringeren Lohn. Und dann gibt es natürlich die ewige Fachkräftemangel-Diskussion. Das ist natürlich auch etwas, was vor dem Hintergrund stattfindet, dieser generellen Debatte, Migrationsstopp, Remigration und so weiter. Wie wird das in der Gewerkschaft reflektiert? Gibt es da überhaupt Kontakt zu Migrantenverbänden? Gibt es da einen Austausch?
Contact to ethnic minority communities? Of course we do. I think trade unions are actually the largest ethnic minority organization in this country, because their numbers reflect the actual working population, and the number of ethnic minority members look very closely at whether or not trade unions focus on their issues and their interests as well. And I think trade unions in recent years have had to catch up a lot. I think there was a policy for many years which focused very much on the ethnic German workers here, but I think it has changed, and that has something to do with the way trade unions have changed and their composition have changed with it. In March, when I started with the Confederation of German Trade Unions, there was a whole debate about recruiting skilled workers from abroad. And it's like you were saying, Alev, it is an instrument which capitalism uses as an element to divide and rule the real workers. You know, labor is costing more and more for capitalist companies, and there are many vacancies, and they need to fill those vacancies. But there's also an international working classes who say that the living conditions are different from one country to another, and this gap between the wealthy and the poor means, why shouldn't I seek my fortune in a country where that's more easily possible? And it's more easily possible in the Western metropolises, and that's why there are more people interested in coming here. And the job of the trade unions is, I think, to ensure that people here don't work under worse conditions here because of where they come from, that they don't, that they aren't over proportionately representative in work that has poor working conditions. For example, we have a department called Fair Mobility.
Kannst du das mal übersetzen?
What does that actually mean, fair mobility? Well, it means it's about workers from Eastern European countries, primarily, who come and work here in the meat industry, the transport industry, many other sectors where they're often exploited and have to work under quite bad conditions. And the DGB has been working on this project to try to offer advice to these workers so that they know what's happening. You remember the Greifenhausen truck driver. That was a major case that happened. And this is where this kind of divide and rule attempts are taking place, where some of this class are exposed to exploiting conditions that lead to this kind of divisions. And you see this with the permanent employees, for example. And the right wing are looking at how they can exploit this. I mean, what we have to counter is to say that solidarity is inviolable and indivisible and isn't based on how people behave. I mean, or rather, where people come from. And I think the trade unions are ensuring that we can counter this divide and rule talk that comes from the far right and ensure that our interests are based on solidarity among the workers against the owners of the companies.
And this policy in the field of migration is something that we need to address in an offensive manner, in an aggressive manner. That would be the right recipe to be used to do something against this division.
Spaltungspolitik, Teilen und Herrschen möchte ich bleiben und Żaklin dich fragen. Also gab ein bisschen Unmut hier im Publikum. Ich kann das nicht genau sagen, ich habe eine Vermutung. Möglicherweise hängt das auch mit diesem Thema zusammen. Also es gab irritierende Äußerungen. Die Partei ist ja nach Sahra Wagenknecht benannt, also BSW, Bündnis Sahra Wagenknecht. Also insofern ist sie nicht irgendeine Figur, eine Akteurin, sondern hat eine zentrale Rolle und sie ist mit irritierenden Äußerungen hervorgetreten, zuletzt im November. Sinngemäß oder Zitat, dass es in Deutschland keinen Platz mehr gebe für Migranten. Die Rede war von schärferem Vorgehen gegen Schleuser, Kappung der Leistung für Asylbezieher. Das war ein Spiel auf einer rechten Klaviatur, so habe ich das empfunden, und war auch im Gegensatz zu dem, was sie früher gesagt hat, auch auf dieser Demo gesagt hat am 25. Februar. Denn es waren immer zwei Dinge, die wir auch, über die wir berichtet haben, die wir auch unterstützenswert fanden als Zeitung, als Redaktion. Sage ich
with an editorial office of a daily newspaper. So there were 2 points. Fighting the root causes of migration and refugees. We need to put an end to this horrible economic policy.
In Unterentwicklung gehaltenen Länder ausgepresst werden, also eine wichtige Fluchtursache und vor allen Dingen Schluss mit der Kriegspolitik. Davon hat man zuletzt wenig gehört. Wie siehst du das?
Put an end to this policy of war. These were the 2 causes that we found worthy to be supported, but we haven't heard much about them recently. What's your view? I'd like to invite you to read the founding program, where you can read a lot. Now, she also talked about human traffickers. Of course, we need to put an end to the work of human traffickers. For people who are being persecuted politically, it's important for them not to have to rely on these human traffickers, these people smugglers, and risking their life. There needs to be the establishment of safe refugee routes. And there is something else that we need to keep in mind, and that is what I also emphasized in my article that you published. The discussion with right-wing parties is closely connected with a conflict with the governing policy. Hardly anybody talks about the root causes of refugees. We talk about the number of people coming here, talking about the people staying at the outside borders, but hardly anybody talks about the reason for why people have to flee their home country, and that's an essential problem. And I'd like to get back to what Alev said. The fight against all right-wing forces is necessary, not only German or Turkish ones, AfD or others, but all right-wing forces. I'd like to give you an example. When I stood at the beginning of the war and somebody shouts Slava Ukraini trade unionists, for me as a migrant coming from Poland, it's a fascist chant, a fascist slogan that was yelled there. It's a chant of the Bandera fascists who killed hundreds of thousands of Poles and Jews. And if that is made admissible, that seems to be okay on the part of the governing policymakers. They are the good fascists, probably. I'm from Poland. For 8 years, a right-wing radical party was in power. But they worked together with them. They worked in parliamentary groups. They voted Ms. von der Leyen. And who are the ones who create these reasons for people to have to flee their countries? Who provides weapons? Who destroys the basis for living with its unjust world order? So it's part of the economic reason in our party. It's so essential for us. And you can read our program. It's recommendable if you read it. They need to be held accountable. We need to develop a sense of a community. People like farmers who are protesting outside should not be denigrated as being right-wing because they are trying to be used by the right-wing parties for their own ends. When people wanted to protest against increasing energy prices, they were also denigrated as being right-wing. And that's where we need to come in. Of course, we fight against AfD, but we need to go beyond that. We need to take a look at the root causes that supports AfD. And this is the policy being made by those in power. The Freedom Index in 2023. In 1990, 78% of the population who responded said that they believe that they can freely express their opinion. In 2023, this number has gone down to how many? Well, it went down. Just give me a guess. What's the percentage? 1%? No. No, it went down significantly. It's now 30%, less than 30% who say that they can express their opinion freely. Why is that the reason? What's the reason for that? You can't articulate your ideas freely. There's a lot of pressure to be politically correct. And I'm looking at the Greens in first place, who are ridiculously enough assumed to be left. And when I'm discussing here on this panel with you, and if the press conference says that BSW is open to the left, and that just shows how limited this discourse is. It just goes to show that the governing politics contributed to this situation also when they engage with the media. And therefore, it's so important to talk to each other, to sit down together. And that's where we'd like to come in aggressively as a new party. Capitalism has war in it, like clouds have rain in them. If we neglect this truth, and all the parties are doing it, they gave their support to this 100 billion pledge. The AfD is in favor of massive arms build-up and for other countries becoming NATO members. It presents itself as an anti-establishment party, and it has been explained that it's not, but to show them for what they are, we need to show those in power.
Jetzt hast du, Żaklin, zunächst gesprochen von Vernunft, von Willensbekundungen, und jetzt bist du doch auf den Kapitalismus und damit auf die Systemfrage zu sprechen gekommen. Shabnam, möchtest du direkt darauf antworten?
Żaklin, do you want to answer to that? Well, our party is anti-capitalist. That's, of course, out of the question. But Żaklin, I think there was one thing that you didn't touch on, namely the question what it's all that was asked initially. Stefan and myself, people who have the right to vote here, we asked the question, what about this term? People who are refugees, the people smuggler should be punished, and people who want to escape their own countries shouldn't be given the possibilities to leave their countries. Yes, I'm in favor of fighting root causes for refugees. I don't need to say that. It's a no-brainer, but there's something that we need to know. Everybody who flees their country, who migrate, they never do it voluntarily, full stop. I came to Germany at the age of 12, and I know all these stories of people leaving their home country and know how difficult it is. But we, being the party of the working class, we work internationally, and I think it's very important to keep that in mind. Everybody who understands themselves as working class members, and these are people who are out there fleeing their countries, who are being thrown around the world as a result of the consequences of capitalism, we need to also represent these people. It's part of our job. And that is what kind of puzzles me, without wanting to further delve on root causes of refugees. I'm totally in favor of addressing these root causes, but I think we need to understand our job. Well, by way of an addition, I also came here from Poland, and I lived on refugee vessels and other shelters. And the 7 of us who left the party have their own refugee history and background. None of us was born to rich families, mainstream society. But there's something that I'd like to make very clear. For many years, early on, I helped refugees. When I'm in a shelter where somebody is politically persecuted, coming from countries, and he says, the person who I escaped from is also here, you cannot pretend as if they were all sitting in the same boat, pulling in the same direction in the migrant communities. That's not the case. Alev described it. She talked about the Turkish communities. We have the right-wing members there. We have them in the Polish community and German communities. We have them everywhere. This social question is something that we need to pay priority attention to. It's not about sexuality and origin, but that's the core idea behind it, which is why I described it. The social question has been neglected by those in power for a long period of time. Look at the figures, 1990. We have the highest poverty quota since 1990. I talked about the trust in politicians. and freedom of expression. But we're now living in a time where we are witnessing the highest poverty quota ever since reunification, and at the same time, the largest number of rich people. 81% of the property is being held by 1% of the population. That is where we need to come in, and this is what we do with BSW, because we do not want to distinguish according to the origin where people come from, and don't do it. I don't want to give asylum protection to any from the grey
So, jetzt, Luca, ist durch die Hintertür die Organisationsfrage doch aufs Tapet gekommen, Perspektive Kommunismus, Deutsche Kommunistische Partei. Was ist eure Perspektive, organisationsbezogen?
With regard to the organization? Luca. Well, if you ask now why we're not organized within the DKP, the German Communist Party, we would say that there is not a single Communist Party in Germany, although many would bear the name of such a party. Because we do not believe that you become a Communist Party by calling yourself communist. A Communist Party which deserves this name is something that is forged in the class struggles and can only develop from here. And we also believe a revolutionary strategy for being able to overcome capitalism is something that cannot be made visible today. It will become visible only at a certain stage of class awareness, which is at a very low level in Germany currently. And this is why we believe it is misleading to say that's the way forward, that's the Communist Party, and we just need to follow them. That's definitely not the case. We believe many organizations are preempting a lot of things and are doing hasty steps. We try to be more cautious. We try to collect experiences in struggles and build up structures. And for us, that not only means the building up of an organization, of a single communist organization as such, but we're rather talking about a comprehensive side in the class struggle. We try to build up political structures in the various areas of political struggles. We want to create left spaces, a counterculture. We want to be present on the streets, and all that would be put under the general term of a counterpower. That is what we want to build up, and I believe we can do that these times. We are active on the ground, on a local level, but we also take part in general national activities. We want to bundle experiences and take people along and help them to respond to political developments. And at some point in time, we want to be part of a Communist Party establishing itself in Germany at some point in time in the future.
So, die Zeit ist fortgeschritten, aber ich möchte doch die Runde beschließen mit einer kleinen Runde zu einer konkreten Frage, die auch linke Gemüter bewegt, nochmal ganz konkret runtergebrochen. AfD-Verbot, ja oder nein? Versucht mal möglichst kurz zusammenzufassen, ob ihr dafür, dagegen seid und welchen Gründen geht. Vielleicht machst du den Anfang.
Or not, and what the reasons are for your position. Maybe you could start, Gerd. The debate about a ban is justified because we're dealing with a largely fascist party, so therefore the debate itself is justified. But I am skeptical. The hurdles are very high. I believe that a procedure to ban the AfD would backfire. I wouldn't be successful. I understand the debate. It can be helpful as a debate, but I'm very skeptical when it comes to concrete attempt to ban this party. Żaklin? Well, I subscribe to what Gerd says. It's very complicated in legal terms. And secondly, these thoughts are not going to disappear only because they are being prohibited and banned. I also believe that we need to address the root causes for why these parties emerge and rise. They would find different ways. They would establish a new party. So they've got a lot of capital to support them and to organize a new party if need be. So if you want to ban this party and this attempt fails, that would give them a lot of support. They would present themselves as being victims, and capitalize on this and benefit from the situation. It's very difficult. Yes, I also believe that what has been said regarding this question is right. It's good to have such a debate because then you can show the fascist ideas and ideology behind this party. But I also believe that that doesn't reduce their electorate. There need to be other ways to do so. And a ban of the party, a prohibition of this party, can also be something that can be turned against us from the left as well, and that is something that we also need to factor in. I need to disappoint you. I don't have a very clear answer to this question normally. DIDF says that all racist and fascist organizations and parties need to be prohibited, but I hold a similar view like the previous speakers. We're dealing here with a party which is at 37% of the electorate. And the policy they are pursuing, the influence they have on the grassroots level is something that is not going to disappear as a result of a ban. And this debate, the kind of which it's being waged, particularly upon the initiative of the Social Democrats and the Greens, is hypocritical. Because in such a ban, they don't have to look at what they did in their own parties in terms of laying the fertile ground for this party, the AfD, to rise on. They just want to say, oh, they are a threat for us in Parliament. They're not even a threat to the democracy. They just cost votes, and this is why we want to have them banned. This is not credible as an argument. And by way of an addition, one or two points that I'd like to add.
First of all, we have to ask where this demand to ban the AfD comes from. Is it from the centrist SPD and CDU? And if so, you can see it's a battle between different mainstream parties who are trying to get each other's electorate and voters, but actually there are various different groups of capital between transatlantic capital, where to a sort of international capital, and you see these breaks within the big tent parties in terms of banning the AfD, yes or no, here in Germany. So for us, it's not a question of supporting that. Also because it isn't realistic that a bourgeois state will ever implement a ban on fascism consistently. There's never been a historical case of this. We see fascism as an option that will always be there if capitalism exists. It's always an option of getting out of a crisis.
Danke, Luca.
And that's why we don't think it'll be successful in this case either, not least for all of the other reasons that have been referred to. And finally, it's also dangerous for us because there's a certain passivity that is called for from us, for anti-fascist groups, that we should leave battling fascism with the state. But we know that anti-fascist structures are the only ones who can push the far right back.
So, Luca, das nehmen wir als Schlusswort. Herzlichen Dank. Luca, vielen Dank, Alev. Danke, Shabnam. Żaklin, dass du da warst. Toll. Gerd, herzlichen Dank. War eine spannende Runde. Und wer stoppt die Rechten? Naja, wir natürlich. Also, in diesem Sinne.
Who's going to stop the far right? Well, we are, of course. On this note.